What's good, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to another SK Wealth Academy podcast number 85. A University of Pennsylvania neurobiology researcher tells the truth behind the pandemic lockdown. Now, I'm quite excited actually about today's podcast because we have a lot to cover. I spent hours and hours of research for this topic, and I think I've come up with some very unique perspectives as far as why the entire world has reacted so harshly to this viral pandemic. So sit back, grab a glass of wine, or a cup of coffee if you're watching this in the morning, and hopefully my storage won't run out on my phone, which I'm recording this on. So depending about how, I think this is going to be a really long podcast. So if it does cut off like all of a sudden and this podcast is ends, just don't worry, come back to my channel and I'll finish podcasting part 2 of this particular topic. Now, many people falsely associate academic pedigree with intellect and therefore falsely extrapolate an impressive academic pedigree with trustworthiness. Those of you that have been following me for a while know that I've spoken about this very topic many times in the past. So, for example, we can visit podcasters with millions of subscribers right now on YouTube, and we can see how many of their videos are titled Harvard researcher, blah, 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 Harvard doctor, blah, 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 Oxford economist, blah, 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 Princeton economist, blah, 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 simply to convey the very false, immediate, knee-jerk reaction from their subscribers that this person is an expert in their field and therefore the podcast is worth a listen. Now, this may be true, but then again, this very well may not be true. For example, I listened to a podcast in which a Harvard researcher stated very authoritatively that we know that the current virus that's causing this global pandemic leapt from a bat to a human, and that is how it got into the population. However, the manner in which, I don't actually disagree with that statement, but this is the kicker. The manner in which he phrased that statement implied that it happened through a natural process, which is an impossible conclusion to draw for the following reason. The only way to know how the bat coronavirus was transmitted to the human population worldwide and beginning in Wuhan is to find patient 0 and to study patient 0. So thus far, patient 0 remains unknown. There is the person known as the first person to show symptoms, but that person is not believed to be patient 0, which would be the first person from which the bat coronavirus leapt from a bat into a human. So what the Harvard researcher concluded was invalid. So again, we don't know if the first person to show symptoms was patient 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. We just know that he's not believed to be patient 0, or he or she. I can't remember the gender of the first person to show symptoms. So it would be as if I titled every podcast in which I spoke about the pandemic, University of Pennsylvania researcher with a neurobiology degree tells you the truth about the pandemic. And that's the dumbest title ever. And you may be saying, isn't that the title of this podcast? Yes, but as a social experiment, I gave this podcast that title just to see if that title alone helps this podcast generate more views than normal. Now, there's nothing in that title that is a lie. I graduated from the University of Pennsylvania. I studied neurobiology, and I am a researcher. So there's nothing that is false about that except the truth about the pandemic. That's how we get people to view our podcast. We say, oh, I'm the only one telling you the facts, giving you the truth and whatnot. So now that you know that this podcast title is a cheeky title, not meant to be taken seriously, then in reality, the YouTube algorithm will likely have a difficult time figuring out whether or not to ban or promote this particular podcast, because I'm going to speak about a narrative supported by the mainstream that a BLS Level 4 lab in China, BLS standing for Bio-Level Safety, developed the virus as a bioweapon, because that's a really popular theory that is circulating, especially amongst Americans right now, as well as the alternative theory that the pandemic is being hyped by the media to strip away our sovereign rights. So I'm going to provide zero conclusion about either view and merely present my research tell you there's not enough evidence to support a definitive conclusion of either view, and allow you to make up your own mind based upon the information I have uncovered, as any unbiased researcher would do. So an intelligent discussion that does not force feed a view upon the viewer and allows him or her to make up his or her own mind with an honest discussion of knowns and unknowns, especially given that the balance of weight lies with the unknowns versus the knowns about a situation, is something that Google/YouTube has no idea how to handle as far as its algorithm of what videos uploaded to YouTube they promote and they shadow ban, because normally they will just promote anything that agrees with the mass media narrative and then shadow ban or censor anyone that's promoting the alternative independent perspective. So when someone does neither and allows a viewer to decide what is right and wrong, as I'm going to do in this podcast, the Google algorithm may not know what to do and may get a little bit confused. But were I to fathom a guess on how they handle such situations, I would guess that it does not look favorably upon content that encourages people to not blindly follow any narrative, whether mainstream or independent, and deem any narrative that encourages people to think for themselves as dangerous. In any event, I'm going to discuss both sides of common narratives that reside on opposite sides of the spectrum, present the facts, the knowns and the unknowns, and give you my opinion on why governments have severely impaired and or destroyed the ability of that segment of society least able to weather the long duration of not receiving a paycheck with their responses to this pandemic. And as you may already guess, it has zero to do with the state's concern for our welfare. In any event, I'm sure you can recall all the scientists that were modeling and predicting how many people were going to die from this virus, and I'm sure that many people blindly believed the rubbish they were spouting, simply because they assessed these scientists to be intelligent. In the UK, the initial reported models of predicted deaths by scientists reported that 500,000 Brits would die. And then this number was radically adjusted downward to just 200,000, and then radically adjusted downward a second time, to the latest prediction that I've heard this week of just 20,000. This week being the week of April 5th. Well, today's April 15th. I probably won't upload this maybe until next week, but as of April 15th, the latest models I heard were predicting just 20,000 deaths. So obviously the initial prediction of 500,000 dead from the viral pandemic in the UK was based off of some extremely poor and non-robust assumptions built into their predictive models. So let's look at the facts and unknowns behind the theory that the virus was a bioengineered weapon that escaped from the BLS-4 lab in Wuhan. So to begin, there is zero evidence that any bats were ever sold in the Wuhan wet market. As far as all the research I could find, there wasn't a single witness that recalled seeing live bats being sold in the Wuhan wet market. However, there was a scientist, Shi Zhengli, the deputy director of the Wuhan BLS-4 lab, which is the level that is the highest risk rating of any biolab in the world. It's BLS-4. Many other nations have them, and I'll go through that list later. But she published numerous articles in medical journals that indicated she was trying to re-engineer a coronavirus that lived inside bats to be more easily transmissible to human beings. So there was an article that was published in Nature Medicine. So that was the name on November 9th of 2015, so about 4.5 years ago, and in which the scientists that worked at the Wuhan lab investigated a virus called SHC-014, which was found in a particular bat species called horseshoe bats in China. And they created a chimeric virus made up of a surface protein of that particular virus and the backbone of a SARS virus that had been adapted to grow in mice and to mimic human disease. And I'm just reading this article, and I'll explain it a little bit later. So the Chimera infected the Chimera virus infected human airway cells, and it proved that the surface protein of SHC-014 had the necessary structure to bind to a key receptor on the cells to infect them. So though almost all coronaviruses isolated from bats have not been able to bind to the key human receptor, the SHC-014 virus, which was found in horseshoe bats in China, was the first to do so. So given the meat of this particular research study that was published in November 2015, Simon Wade Hobson, a virologist at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, pointed out that the researchers had created a novel virus that, quote unquote, grows remarkably well in human cells. He went on to say, quote, if the virus escaped, nobody could predict the trajectory. Now, Wayne Hobson's view of the danger of this type of research being conducted by the Wuhan BLS for doctors and scientists was seconded by the very U.S. scientist that developed the U.S. Bioweapons Act, Dr. Francis Boyle, who went on to state there's no reason for BLS level 4 labs to exist anywhere in the world, not just in China, but anywhere in the dozens of nations that currently operate them. And he said the only reason they exist is to weaponize viruses. But he also stated that the current virus spreading around the world was a bioengineered weapon. So while I agree with Dr. Boyle's former statement, I do not agree with his latter, because I believe all BLS-4 labs worldwide should be shut down, and I'll tell you the reason why very shortly. But whether or not Boyle's assessment of the origins of our current pandemic as a bioengineered viral weapon is true or not, it's only a matter of time before an even more virulent and deadly viral strain is manufactured and escapes into the world and wipes out millions of us. So, as I already stated, though, this is the reason I disagree with his latter conclusion that our viral pandemic was artificially created. Because without knowing who patient zero is, it's impossible for Boyle's claim to be substantiated. And if we could find patient zero, then we would know. So is it plausible? Of course. Is it a fact? No. So again, people need to stop stating things as facts that are definitely not facts. In addition, though it's plausible that the original stories released by China about the virus originating at the wet market are untrue, and I would tend to believe they are untrue, then we can't take that probable conclusion and then extrapolate it to wild speculation, as was done by a viral documentary. It just went viral, I believe, like this week, called The True Origins of the Wuhan Coronavirus. It stoked a lot of claims that the virus was bioengineered, so much so that recent polls conducted this week showed that 1 out of about every 3 Americans now believe the virus was a Chinese bioengineered weapon. However, from the jump, the strong anti-Chinese bias in this documentary is apparent, which makes the conclusions of the documentary suspect, as any good documentary would take a much more balanced approach to questions they are attempting to answer, instead of just presenting one heavily biased side to the question posed. And furthermore, the Epoch Times, the producer of the documentary, is allegedly, I say allegedly because I didn't really have time to research this in depth, they're allegedly a heavy President Trump supporter. So do I believe that China was non-transparent? And the reason that's important is because then they'd be more prone to make something that has an anti-China bias. So do I believe that China was non-transparent and did not reveal true statistics about the viral epidemic from the start? Yes. All of the circumstantial evidence, and there's a mountain of it, points to that. Does this mean I should blindly allow this opinion to infect every thought I have regarding whether the virus was bioengineered as a weapon by the Wuhan lab as fact? Of course not. And within minutes into this documentary, I already discovered problems with the implications made by this documentary. So, for example, the interviewer, I can't remember his name, but he interviewed a Chinese-American doctor and about the viability of the Chinese government narrative that the virus originated in a wet market. And the doctor stated that nearly 1/3 of 14 of the first 41 known patients that showed symptoms of this viral pandemic in Wuhan had zero contact and, quote, seemed to be unrelated, end quote, to the Wuhan wet market infections, implying that there is strong evidence that the Chinese story is a lie. And even though I don't believe that the virus originated in the wet market, I don't believe that official Chinese narrative, this is certainly speculation that's being promoted, not proof by this Chinese American doctor, and not any evidence that the Chinese narrative was a lie. And I'll tell you actually what is more substantial proof that the Chinese narrative was a lie. But for example, the Chinese American shows a quote unquote official looking bar graph that merely shows that 14 of the first 41 infected patients never visited the wet market. So what is my reaction to that? I mean, people might easily fall for that as proof, but he never says how they know that the 14 people that were among the first 41 known patients that were showed symptoms had zero contact with the other 27 people that visited the market, or any contact with any of the other people the 27 people had contact with that visited the market. In other words, because the 27 people that visited the market could have infected someone else that was asymptomatic, could have infected someone else that was asymptomatic, that could have infected one of those 14 people, then that's why that Chinese American doctor said, quote, seem to be unrelated, which certainly is less than stellar concrete proof. And in other words, it's nearly, actually, I don't believe that it is nearly impossible. It is impossible to prove that those 14 people had no connection to the other 27 people that were infected that had some kind of tie to that wet market. So I can easily spot rubbish propaganda that's provided as quote unquote evidence in many narratives that are being spouted and going viral at the current time. So in other words, the documentary consistently makes wild, unprovable correlations using the widely accepted fact that the Chinese government hid the known severity, known number of infections, and known numbers of deaths as support for their bioengineered weapon theory, even though there's no correlation between these two claims, one of which is fairly easy to prove, that's true, and the other which is riddled with unknowns that cloud the plausibility of the claim. So the more obviously compelling evidence that perhaps the virus originated from that Wuhan lab is the fact that there were no bats being sold in that wet market. This is a bat coronavirus, and that bat coronavirus was being researched at that lab. So should the type of research being conducted by Dr. Shi be stopped immediately due to the risks that far outweigh any potential benefit? In my opinion, absolutely. But again, the ethical debate over this matter is not black and white, and my answer to that question is merely what I stated, my opinion. However, just because I believe such research to be unethical, again, does not translate into the fact that there was a chimeric, bioengineered, human-altered virus that leaked from the lab. And it may very well have, but again, this is simply unknown. So we can't extrapolate other horrible behaviors of a state government just to make wild allegations without any proof. And in the Epoch Times documentary, a female molecular biologist also falsely claimed that, quote, the spike proteins of the natural evolutionary strains of coronavirus don't infect humans, end quote. That's a pretty straightforward, blunt claim. Unfortunately, it's not true. So first, allow me to explain what are spike proteins on a virus. By now, everyone has probably seen, right, that graphical representation of the coronavirus as a ball with prickly growths covering the outside of that sphere. So the prickly growths are what is known as spike proteins, or S proteins for short. And they serve as a key that binds to receptors in human cells and allows a virus entry into the cell to infect the cell, multiply, and wreak havoc with our health. So additionally, this biologist backs the claims of the Chinese American doctor by stating that, quote, the supposed, look how vague and opaque this language is, the supposed patient zero was nowhere near the wet market, end quote. But just stop for a second and look at the vague, shady language that's being used all throughout by the so-called experts that proliferate this documentary, that identifies everything the doctors and scientists say as their view of, quote, what really happened, end quote, as pure speculation. So the supposed patient zero means of real patient zero is not known. So no conclusion can be drawn from the supposed patient zero. And furthermore, the Chinese American doctors claim that a significant percentage of initially infected patients, as I already discussed, quote, seem to be unrelated, end quote, to the other infected patients. You can't draw any conclusion because he's saying like seemingly, apparently, with no provision of concrete proof. So such conclusions are known in the world of critical thought as pure speculation. And how do I know the molecular biologist claims of the bat coronavirus strain being unable to leap directly from bats to humans are untrue? I know this because I actually read one of the many of medical papers that the Chinese BLS-4 deputy director published, in which it was written in plain text in that article, quote, "The results of the research at the Wuhan lab indicate that the group 2B viruses encoding the SHC014 spike in a wild-type backbone can efficiently use multiple orthologs of the SARS receptor human angiotensin-converting enzyme 2, ACE2, to replicate efficiently in primary human airway cells and achieve in vitro titers equivalent to epidemic strains of SARS-CoV," end quote. Thus, leading the Chinese doctor that published this research to conclude that there existed, quote, "a potential risk of SARS-CoV," which I imagine stands for COVID, reemergence from viruses currently circulating in bat populations, end quote. So in plain English, for those lacking a molecular biology background that don't understand what this means, it means, and I didn't have to ask anyone for this because of my background in neurobiology and molecular and cellular biology in university. And even though that was ages ago, I still, recall how to interpret all this type of information, the scientific information. And basically, in plain English, it means a Chinese doctor discovered in her research that the bat coronavirus, contrary to the belief at that time, that it would need a third-party host before jumping to humans, and that's where the speculations of it perhaps being transmitted through pangolins or through snakes first. It meant that the Chinese doctor discovered that the coronaviruses and these particular species of bats were capable of jumping directly from bats to humans. And this is also the reason why that the ethical question of this research is not black and white, though it becomes a lot more black and white in a second. I'll explain why. But this is the initial argument why it's not a black and white, truly unethical research. Because knowledge discovered through research like this can push the urgency of developing vaccines for different animal strains of coronavirus to the forefront before they can make the leap into humans. When it's discovered, direct transmission from bats to humans is more plausible than believed prior to the absence of such research, at least in theory. Okay, so here's the kicker. Because this research was published in 2015, 4.5 years ago, and it failed to compel any global pharmaceutical company in the entire world to research the development of a bat coronavirus vaccine, likely because developing vaccines for a virus that may or may not leap from bats to humans is not a profitable business-making decision. So unless the business model of the pharmaceutical industry changes, or it's not purely driven by profit, it's fairly safe, I believe, to conclude at this present time that the potential benefits of such dangerous research are not being cultivated or pursued at all. So for this reason, it is my opinion that such research that allows such viruses to be synthetically engineered to make a viral crossover into human DNA more efficient and more virulent than its form in nature, and therefore weaponized, because the potential negatives far outweigh the positives, because the positives are never acted upon unless corporations completely change their business model to take the impact of human social impact into consideration in their profit business, their business making decisions. Then I believe all type of this kind of research should be stopped worldwide, not just in China. So this would require shutting down similar BLS-4 level labs in Australia, Belarus, Canada, the US, Russia, France, Germany, the Czech Republic, Gabon, India, Japan, the UK, Holland, and Italy, among other nations. That's not even the complete list. And speaking of Italy, you guys are going to find this fascinating because this was never reported. If the virus could possibly have escaped a BLS-4 lab in Wuhan, and we know that there's always joint ventures in researching viruses because, I'll get to this point later, the US was actually providing millions of research funds to the Wuhan lab in China. Why has no one pointed out that of all the cities in Italy that could have been the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, that there were only 2 BLS level 4 labs in Italy, one in Lombardy and the other domiciled in Rome. And you all know where the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak happened in Italy, right? It happened in Lombardy, exactly where that BLS-4 lab was located. So why has nobody investigated whether or not the Lombardy BLS-4 biolab was investigating the bat coronavirus? And why are they only saying, it definitely leaked from China? Why could it not have leaked into the population from Lombardy I'm saying if, because no one knows, right? No one is even bothering asking the questions. I'm not even an investigative journalist that I would ask, so, and as well, the full published articles of Dr. Shi are not difficult to find, and you can read them all if you like. So it's incumbent upon anyone making a documentary titled, quote, The True Origins of the Wuhan Coronavirus, to read all of Dr. Shi's publicly published research so that one can push back on narratives extolled by scientists you may interview that can be so readily debunked as I just have with a couple of these narratives. And I only read one of Dr. Shi's. I think she has like 4 or 5 published articles. I only read one, and that article was 4.5 years old, to find serious problems with the claims made in the documentary in 2020. You can use research done in 2015 to debunk claims made in that documentary. So imagine what else may be readily dismissed if I had read all the other articles. But I spent maybe 10 hours researching this podcast. I didn't want to, spend 20 hours researching this podcast. So if you want to go ahead, you're a scientist, and read all of our articles, you can go ahead and maybe comment below, add to the library of knowledge on this particular podcast. So if you don't have this scientific background to understand what the article means, if you're making such a documentary, it's incumbent upon you to then hire someone that can break down what her research has stated, so you understand before you go in and interview any of your so-called experts on their beliefs. And the problem I have with so many things stated on the internet that go viral and spread widespread belief about incidents that simply are not facts, but imply they're facts, is this tendency for lazy investigative journalism. So if you're going to apply something in a manner in which people will interpret it as evidence and proof as a narrative, then at least have the decency to thoroughly investigate it. And if you don't have the time to determine if your presented angle is true or not, then merely state up front that you don't know if it is true, as I've been doing all throughout this podcast, but I haven't had the time to research something. I said I simply don't know if it's true, but this is what I've heard. So a lot of the information in the documentary presented with the implication it is true does not even have a shred of solid evidence to back up its claims, but merely use the quote-unquote appeal to authority fallacy, which was one of the biggest fallacies promoted by YouTubers today in making a point. And as I said, it's clear the makers of this documentary never read any of Dr. Shi's papers that she published about her research with the bat coronavirus. So it's quite easy, right, to establish as a fact that scientists at the BLS-4 Wuhan lab were bioengineering coronavirus inside bats to make them more easily transmissible to human beings. So this is an indisputable known, right? These are one of the knowns. But before this known generates anti-Chinese sentiment, allegedly, again, I'm saying allegedly because I haven't researched this deep enough to know 100% that this is true, much of Shi's research was supported with about $3.7 million of U.S. funding. Now, I found multiple articles that all claim this, but I didn't take the time to really dive deep to see if that is true. Because people make claims all the time, and there might have been some funding, maybe to the Wuhan lab, but it wasn't particularly for the study of that bat coronavirus. So people often stretch truth because they want to present a certain angle. That's what I didn't have time to research. So again, I will allow you, the reader of this article or the viewer of this podcast, to get to the bottom of the alleged link between U.S. funding and the efforts of the Wuhan BLS-4 scientists to make the bat coronavirus more easily transmissible to humans. And even though I study molecular biology and virus transmission in university, even researched this topic further on my own outside of school, long after I graduated, reading books like Laurie Garrett's The Coming Plague, and therefore I'm able to read Dr. Shi's research and understand the vast majority of what I read. does this mean I can offer an indisputable conclusion about whether or not the virus that has infected the world now very rapidly was a bioengineered weapon? The answer to this question is simply no, because too many knowns still exist about this situation to answer it definitively one way or another. So the fact that this documentary is now the main impetus for people believing in America the virus was a bioweapon engineered by China is not only disturbing, but it's almost comical. The documentary is full of unprovable unknowns and even false claims as a basis for their conclusion. And get this, because if you understood what I've said at the beginning of this podcast, I went into this documentary actually with a preconceived notion that it would strengthen my belief that the virus was a bioengineered weapon, because I still think there's a high plausibility of that. But it ended up not strengthening this belief of mine a single iota. So because basically, I found no solid scientific proof in this documentary and only speculation being passed onward. And what was I going to say? I lost my train of thought for a second. Sorry. Okay, I got it back. So all of us have heard numerous comparisons of the coronavirus to the much less virulent and dangerous common influenza strain, right? With initial disinformation spread by political leaders that tens of thousands of deaths, as many as 50 to 60,000 deaths results from influenza in the US every year. And that was their methodology to downplay the threat of the coronavirus, because at that time, there's only like 15 infections, no deaths. People was like, hey, why is everyone making such a big deal? 50 to 60,000 people in some years died from the common flu. And however, do you know why this argument was so garbage from the jump? Most to this day still do not. The reason this argument is garbage is because this is admitted. There is no national health organization in the US that compiles mortality figures specifically for the common flu. So in other words, the data reported every year in the US as the amount of quote unquote flu deaths is not only based upon estimate after estimate after estimate, thereby destroying any claims that the reported number could possibly be accurate, but the estimates are drawn from an all-encompassing category of deaths that result from pneumonia, flu, and respiratory infections. So therefore, if a patient was suffering from pancreatic cancer and died from a secondary respiratory complication, or if a patient had severe bronchitis and died after contracting the flu due to an immunocompromised immunity system, or if a patient was 80 years old and with congestive heart failure and contracted the flu and was going to die from heart failure anyway, guess what? The figure you hear of 30,000, 50,000, 60,000 deaths that result from the flu every year is extrapolated from this data that lumps all these different possibilities of cause of death together, and from which very unscientific methodologies or estimates are then drawn to provide the flu death number. Now, if you're listening to this podcast on YouTube, I'm going to put all the links of every source I've referenced in the show notes below, so you can go check it out yourself. And I'm going to put the link to the CDC methodology of how they estimate flu deaths also in this video show notes. So if you visit the site, you'd probably be amused at how long-winded their explanations are as far as how they compile that number of flu deaths every year. And then they don't even provide direct confirmation of how they derive their estimates on the first page, but provide multiple links to other web pages of how they derive their estimates. So in any event, it should be readily apparent that if they report 50,000 flu deaths a year, no one really knows that the number of healthy people, right, that died specifically from contracting the flu was half that number at 25,000, or was it even just 200? We do not know. And the problem that I just described with the manner in which flu deaths are compiled and reported in the United States is also a massive problem with how deaths from the coronavirus are being reported by official state government collection agencies all around the world. Because what is clear is that the most meaningful data of all would be the number of healthy people that had no other serious medical conditions under a retirement age of 65, or whatever age the retirement age is in your nation of residence, that have died from coronavirus. This is the exact data we need to understand how serious is the threat. So, as one of the first Americans to emphasize the severity of the threat to the United States at a time when only 15 people were diagnosed as infected and nobody had yet died, which again, I'll put in the show notes below, which video podcast. I stated that. I'm not saying that I'm not standing by my words from just a couple months ago, in which I stated my belief that this virus was much more severe and dangerous than the common flu and a definite threat. When I state that we need the above data group, how many people that are healthy of working age actually with no other type of afflictions or diseases or conditions that would compromise their immune system actually died from the flu. I'm speaking of understanding the true severity in relation to the draconian response of governments worldwide to this threat. Again, I'm speaking of understanding the true severity in relation to the draconian response of governments worldwide to this threat, which is a very different concept than stating that the viral pandemic is not serious, because even if the coronavirus was killing only the elderly at high rates, I would never dismiss it as a non-serious threat because of the demographic that was most vulnerable to it. So it would still be serious if only old people were dying. However, if data revealed that people with no serious medical conditions who are still of working age die at a mortality rate of 1 in 5,000, then all of us would know that government's responses to this threat is a complete farce. And I believe that governments know, and they're not revealing this information. So they're being just as opaque as China was in reporting statistics to us. So if we knew this, we would then know that only the elderly should remain under temporary self-imposed quarantine measures at home for their own safety, but that everyone else could go back to work in safety and just wear medical face masks and practice social distancing as a precaution, until the viral threat subsided, which we all know it eventually will. So this brings me up to the last portion of this video, which I call given the above unknowns. And there's so many unknowns, right, that I've discussed so far. Why have governments reacted as if the unknowns were the worst possible scenario when they don't know, instead of reacting to the most likely scenario? So as I stated, we have governments counting as deaths attributable to coronavirus, all kinds of deaths that likely should not be lumped into this category because of patients that have pre-existing conditions that made them very vulnerable to not only dying from this coronavirus, but probably dying if they were just infected with the regular flu. So we have no idea the severity of the state response is merited at all. And perhaps even in light of the fact that the pandemic is serious, the severity of their response has zero merit. So what is my theory? Okay, you said it took you so long, but I think setting this up was super important, giving you this background to understand my theory of why governments have responded with the iron fist all over the world to this pandemic. This is my theory, and again, I'm going to emphasize it's just a theory and just my opinion, and it's based upon a bunch of unknowns, so you will need to come to your own conclusions about whether my opinion is viable or not, just as I presented what I know, what I have found out to be knowns and unknowns about the claim the virus was a bioengineered weapon, and you can come to your own conclusions again, because I want you to use your brain. No one should ever blindly believe what any podcaster or YouTuber tells you to believe without doing your own research. I'm not saying that, they're not things we say that are definitively true, but I'm saying you shouldn't be blindly complying to these views and confirm them for yourself. So I believe that this total and very brutal economic lockdown is a test run for more dire times ahead, because I predicted weeks before it started happening that the US mass media, bankers, and politicians would use this viral pandemic as a scapegoat for failing US stock markets and financial markets, and to try to cover up the current fragility of the US banking infrastructure. So they know clearly that the viral pandemic was not the origin of this ongoing financial chaos we continue to experience. And they understood that even in light of the viral pandemic dying off, that a much worse phase of this current economic pandemic, this global economic pandemic, is coming, and that they cannot stop it. So do governments have access to better information than what I just presented? Almost surely, right? So could this be the reason for the global lockdown? Because they have evidence we do not possess. Let me rephrase. Because they may have evidence we do not possess that was a bioengineered weapon, with the likely help of U.S. funding, by the way. And So this possibly could be the reason for their very severe, what seems to us to be out of proportion response to what is known accessible information that we have. Or do governments, this is another possibility, do governments have better information than us? And no, it was not a bioengineered weapon. And they are merely being opportunistic right now to test us, which is my theory. They're running a test to see who will blindly comply to their orders, even when they're really draconian in response to the threat level. And even when it means it could be an end to their livelihood and their means to earning a living. Who will be the problematic ones they want to see that do not comply, so they can start surveilling them as non-compliant individuals when the SHTF in the future, when this whole global economic infrastructure crumbles further. So the latter possibility is what I believe is happening right now. Of course, it's a theory, pure speculation, but nobody knows the truth because our lack of information and the information and transparency of governments about this pandemic is not good enough for us to assess the truth, and I believe that is deliberate. And so, we have seen them falsely frame unknown information as known information already, and multiple times during this entire timeline of mass media reporting about this pandemic. So before I continue with solutions to combat this, should my theory be correct, because they are trying to completely siphon away our souls and our spirits through totalitarian state measures. I want to reference, which was it? I believe it was podcast number 82, in which I talked about how we need to how we should use this quarantine lockdown period to update our operating systems. We need to claim ownership of our operating systems right now. And by failing to respond to totalitarian measures imposed by governments, we cede the right to our own human operating systems to the government. We need to immediately stop genuflecting to every unreasonable order designed to break our wills and take back ownership and control of our own operating systems. And the way we do this is to find the courage to speak our truth to the world. So while I attended university, I took a class with a professor named Dr. Martin Seligman, who had come up with this groundbreaking theory of learned helplessness. And he conducted a study in which he concluded that if humans were controlled to such an extent in which they felt they had no options, then the state of learned helplessness that was artificially created would extend to future situations in which the same human beings that had embraced a state of learned helplessness would be given multiple options available to them, but they would not act because they were embedded in the state of learned helplessness and believed that nothing they would do would improve their situation. So he postulated through experimentation with rats and observing their behavior that the induction of learned helplessness and repeated exposure to learned helplessness during crises in which humans were taught to respond in a manner of feeling helpless, that at a certain point we all would stop trying to change anything, that we certainly become passive and acquiescent over and over to injustices being imposed upon us. So I believe that right now we are in this stage when states are trying to normalize feelings of learned helplessness within us. It's my theory that the global economic lockdown is an attempt by black-hearted people with black souls to instill learned helplessness in us, to steal our energy and to train us to believe we have no options to be free, and that we must obey everything we are taught to do or else. And I sincerely believe with all my heart that right now we are at a turning point in history that is every much as critical as Muhammad Ali's choice not to serve in the Vietnam War, when he chose to sacrifice his best earning years in the prime of his boxing career and protest by going to jail and serving jail time. We are all in the midst of a turning point right now that is very much as important as Mahatma Gandhi's choice to engage in a fast whereby he could possibly starve to death in protest of the British occupation of India. Are we going to exercise our collective consciences and be Ali and Gandhi, or are we going to quietly slip into the night and forever disappear, our voices forgotten, never to be heard again? It is the state's objective right now to normalize a state of learned helplessness within all of us, so that we see nothing wrong with each incrementally more draconian action that they implement. We either must choose to be passive and let the light of liberty be extinguished forever, or we must collectively take a stand right now and keep the fire burning. I've heard so many state that they're going to comply because it's impossible for one person to change anything against the powers that be, and that may be, but there is strength in numbers and unity. That's what we fail to understand. If afraid to stand up, then support those that are willing to stand up and are standing up right now. Do not remain silent. Recall that was not too long ago in U.S. history when U.S. shores were seen as the beacon of freedom for all oppressed immigrants, including the very first British immigrants that established the original 13 U.S. colonies, who were fleeing oppression and tyranny of King George and British bankers. And then they were followed by Irish that fled famine and starvation in Ireland, and they were followed by those that fled totalitarian Russian and Southeast Asian nations during the Cold War, and they were followed by the multiple war refugees that fled multiple wars in their home nations. So millions fled their home nations and fled to America for the freedoms offered within American borders that did not exist within their borders of their own nations. But can we as Americans honestly make this claim today? We not only have a parasitic economy with bankers feeding off the 99% in every nation by using derivatives, the little understood mechanisms of fractional reserve banking and technology to transfer the money of the 99% of every nation's citizens to themselves in the upper 1% of wealthiest citizens in every nation, but they are also attempting to turn the energy of every nation into a parasitic relationship in which they feed off of our energy by embedding an idea within all of us that is an impossibility for us to win this battle. And this is the delusional operating system that parasites install in all of us through the concept of learned helplessness. They make us believe we have no power and they have all the power, when in reality, who is the stronger party in a parasitic relationship, the parasite or the host? Who is the stronger party in a parasitic relationship, the parasite or the host? The parasite can only win the battle by tricking the host, meaning us, into believing we have no power. But if we, the host, believe in our own power, we could easily rise up and expunge the parasite from our systems. So we are witnessing lockdowns, which I believe are a big social experiment to observe our response to it, happening on every continent on planet Earth, in the West, in Europe, and in Asia. No region in the world has escaped the execution of this plan. And the most totalitarian of all was launched by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in which he locked down an entire nation of 1.48 billion Indians. Is that I think that's the population, close to 1.5 billion Indians. And he's ordered police to beat down anyone that leaves their homes, even if they need to do so to survive. And because so many poor Indians do need to leave their homes to survive, many have defied Modi's despotic orders and been relentlessly beaten by mindless police. Okay, so this is actually going to be the last part to wrap up, but as I'm going on 48 minutes, I'm really worried about running out of storage and this video abruptly just cutting off. So I'm going to end this video. Please do comment below the question I want to ask. Let me scroll to the very end, but I'm going to come back and make a part 2 that's probably going to be about 20 minutes long. The question is, please let me know what you think about the purpose of this lockdown, and come back on part 2 because I'm not done. And tell me what you think about the additional information, my additional theory I'm going to espouse in part 2. And again, there are no facts that support my opinions, but I'm fairly certain there is a connection between the lockdown and not the virus, but between the lockdown and the coming riots and chaos that bankers and politicians know is on the way as a result of the coming collapse of currency, stocks, and real estate. So do you agree or disagree with my assessment that the lockdown is a test run for a coming economic pandemic, and to strip us of our beliefs that we have control over our own lives if we only believe in ourselves? Leave a comment below. If you have different theories, leave a comment below. And let other people, let's get this discourse started. So again, we can provide a lot of additional benefit through our small but growing SK Wealth Academy community. And thanks so much for watching. Please smash that subscribe button and notification bell if you have not yet done so. Let's get to 1,000 subscribers within the end of April. And as always, remain intensely curious. So long.